Good evening, everyone. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider with you on this 10th of September. As always, we encourage you to stay up to date with your local weather information from your Alaska National Weather Service. You can do that easily by calling us on the Alaska Weather Information Line, 1-800-472-0391, or find us online at weather.gov/Alaska or any of our social media accounts, usually starting with NWS, Anchorage, Juneau, Alaska, or Fairbanks. Find us on Twitter and on Facebook and even on YouTube. As you've probably noticed, a pretty decent storm out to our west coming our way, and because of that, ahead of it, we're going to have some strong southerly winds. We might have gusts up to 60 miles per hour around some of the Alaska range, including the Denali region, and on the downsloping side of that, we probably will have some pretty warm weather, including areas around the Middle Tanana Valley and Fairbanks. But if you are driving through any of the passes, the Tok Cutoff, around Delta Junction out toward the west, around Broad Pass, there's a potential you're going to see some pretty gusty travel there in the next 24 to 36 hours, so be prepared for that. Again, winds up to about 45 miles per hour, some gusts maybe as strong as 60 there. That'll be for Wednesday night and into Thursday. And then a high surf advisory, including areas along the south-facing shoreline of the Seward Peninsula, and so places like the Nome Council Road could see some high surf come up and crash over the beach there, so be prepared for that. And again, a high surf advisory for Wednesday morning. Tonight and into early Thursday morning as we go into the next 24 hours there with a strong southerly wind coming up there. And again, most areas along the west will be watching this carefully. The Willock River, we were talking about this yesterday, it did crest as we're looking at Saturday, and then you can see how it's kind of come down a little bit on Monday and then back up on Tuesday overnight. And it's going back down again as we go into the afternoon. So kind of up and down and all around, but we're watching this because it is running a little bit high right now. And of course, we know that downstream is a pretty important source for Kivalina. So we're keeping an eye on that. And there is some heavy rain coming our way. Right now, the main focus for heavy or flooding rain is really going to be around the Chignik area, Kodiak Island, the Seward region, all the way down toward Homer and Kachemak Bay, and maybe up toward Whittier there. This is all going to be a system that is associated with what was previously Faxia. This is a tropical remnant there, or you can call it a typhoon. It's not a typhoon anymore, but the moisture that was once wrapped up in the system did have a name, and we did call it Faxia there. As this is passing through as we go into Thursday, the potential for some periods of heavy rain are certainly there, and some of that may focus on western parts of Alaska at times as well. Maybe not as much in a concentrated fashion like what we were just showing. And this is really important stuff because if you go back to last week when we were talking about the drought monitor, the last update was last Thursday. We'll have one in another 2 days here, so hopefully some new information for us. Southern parts of Southeast still in extreme drought. Parts of South Central, including the Matanuska and Susitna Valleys and the Kenai Peninsula into the Anchorage area, also in extreme drought. And many other locations are at least moderately dry with the drought conditions there into that orange range. So a lot of places can use a decent amount of water over a longer period of time. Fire danger continues to improve. Right now we're still seeing higher fire danger levels there around the Copper River Valley up into the Alaska Range and the Upper Tanana Valley, and certainly the Yukon Flats and around the Middle Tanana Valley itself. Look for that to improve as we get more rain in the region in the coming days. Satellite picture shows low pressure in the Gulf of Alaska. This is getting organized, and by the end of the week, it does look like it'll have some potential to put down some nice wetting rains there across parts of southeastern Alaska. Out to the west, you can see the next weather system slowly creeping into the region. Cloud cover spilling into the Bering Sea, and areas along the west coast starting to see a lot of low clouds in advance of that, but really the majority of the weather system still off to your west. Up north, a fairly dry and mild day. Temperatures in the overnight hours have been very mild, with readings there in the 40s. Daytime highs once again back in the 60s. You can see even though the weather system is passing through the North Slope, it's not a whole lot to write home about right now. Down to our south, you see low pressure at 992 millibars. This is going to spread more cloud cover eastward as we go. The big weather maker in the Alaska Weather Department really is out to sea at 978 millibars there in the western Bering. That is creeping eastward tonight, and a very broad and strengthening southerly flow coming up the west coast. As high pressure moves out of the way for south central, wind should come up across parts of the Alaska Range as we go into tomorrow. And again, that could produce gusts to 45, maybe 60 miles per hour across some of the Alaska Range passes especially, and it's certainly a choppy day for any aviators traveling in the region. The wind's also really going to focus on the west here, and like we were saying, some areas across the south-facing shorelines of the Seward Peninsula we'll be looking at high surf, and that potential will be with us as we go through the next 24 to 36 hours. Again, the Nome Council Road one of those places we're watching. Periods of moderate to occasionally heavy rain will be possible, and some stronger gusts, maybe up to 60 miles per hour around the Bristol Bay region and Lake Iliamna as well. High pressure gets out of the way eventually, and it will allow that to move into south central. Low pressure starts to move back into southeast. Look for a fairly wet day there as we get into Thursday. Rain again continues Thursday into Friday for southeast, with low pressure moving across the south central regions. Low pressure out across the central and eastern Bering Sea means periods of moderate to heavy rain coming up the west coast as well. Areas of fog across the north slope, and the front continues to linger across western parts of Alaska as we go into the end of the week. So this will be something to wrap up the rest of your Friday and probably Saturday with as well. A quick check of temperatures around the region on Wednesday. 40s and 50s in southeast, a mild start to south central. Many areas near 50 degrees once again. A mild night for the middle Tanana Valley, but outlying areas like Healy out toward Eagle and let's say Northway, easily in the 30s. 40s for the north slope, mid to upper 40s for parts of west and southwest. Bristol Bay temperatures just shy of 50, and you can see the middle Tanana Valley back around 63 degrees.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
And on to your aviation weather now. IFR conditions will set in across a fast-moving front working through the Bering, St. Matthew, St. Paul, and St. George, and as well as your central and eastern Aleutian chain locations, likely starting off with IFR in the morning. Out ahead of that system, we're going to see scattered areas of IFR, and that includes parts of Tin City, Wales, all the way down toward Nome, and up toward Unalak, Clayton, across a large part of the YK coastline, at least MVFR, and maybe worse at IFR conditions. Now, a broader area of IFR is expected across the south-facing slopes of the Brooks Range. As we start up in the morning, look for VFR around Utqiagvik to Wainwright and east toward Prudhoe Bay and Deadhorse. Kaktovik may be just in an IFR zone there, and just south of you, watch for some hit-and-miss IFR across some of the passes, including Anaktuvik and Adigan Pass. South of that, through the Yukon Valley, things look pretty good. VFR conditions expected there until you get back into the Alaska Range and you're looking at IFR. Surrounding some of the lowlands, most of the areas along Cook Inlet through the Barren Islands and down toward Kodiak should be looking at VFR, but Kodiak Island is going to be hit-and-miss marginal conditions there. Southeast looking to be VFR for the most part in the morning. You'll start to see marginal conditions setting in from about Petersburg and Wrangell south into parts of the Clarence Strait, Hyder, Ketchikan, Annette, and all the way out toward Craig and Klawock. As you get out into the Gulf, hit and miss marginal conditions there, but out to the west, you'll notice that front is really focusing the IFR conditions across places like Cape Newenham, southward toward almost Dillingham, and then Sandpoint westward toward Adak and Atka, looking at IFR conditions there. Marginal conditions will linger around some of the south central high terrain as well as the Brooks Range and parts in the west. IFR conditions also set into the Beaufort Seacoast, and you'll see that dropping a little bit further southward Thursday morning, closing off Utqiagvik and out toward Prudhoe Bay and Deadhorse, south toward some of your higher terrain passes, and southwest still looking at IFR conditions hit and miss throughout the afternoon and into Thursday morning as well as Prince William Sound, Kenai Fjords region, Kodiak Island, and southern parts of southeast. That entire system is moving pretty quickly south and east, and as that moves into the Gulf, more areas will be looking at marginal conditions for Thursday afternoon. IFR across some of the Chugach and Prince William Sound locations, the Alaska Range, hit and miss across south and east, and the North Slope, especially from Wainwright eastward, looking at IFR with marginal conditions pretty extensive out on the west coast and over the Bering. Now, as far as your pass conditions go for your Wednesday, Anaktuvik and Adigan Pass, we expect those to be IFR pretty much all day long. Lake Clark and Merrill Pass look to be IFR. Don't forget to check out your FAA weather cameras and, in fact, verify conditions before you take off. Rainy Pass looking to be IFR throughout the day. Windy Pass could see some modest improvement to marginal levels there. Isabel Pass looking to be MVFR by the afternoon. Mentasta Pass starts at VFR but leans over toward marginal conditions as the day goes on. Tanita Pass we expect to see IFR to start your Wednesday morning. Marginal may develop in the afternoon. Again, we saw that on the map, so make sure you check those out on the webpage anytime. Portage Pass, IFR conditions, and then leaning over to some improvement as the afternoon goes on. Chilkoot and White Pass, maybe one more day at VFR, looks like, for your Wednesday. Freezing levels show a lot of warming taking place out here ahead of that next weather system. It's a deepening low pressure system drawing up a lot of south and southwesterly flow coming up off the Pacific, levels into Bristol Bay, the Alaska Peninsula, and even the furthest west areas there moving into the eastern chain, running between 6 and about 10,000 feet. Some of the cooler air already making its way into the northwestern parts of the coast, but nothing terribly significant yet that's going to drop that freezing level enough to have a huge impact on our icing chart just yet. We're still looking at levels that are above 9 to 10,000 feet, I should say, above maybe isolated moderate across the west and southwest and across the central and eastern Beaufort Seacoast and the eastern Brooks Range. Now, we don't see a whole lot of threats across the interior, across southeast or across southwest right now. And again, things are pretty modest at this point. Our main power maker, our power player in the weather department right now is low pressure here across the Bering. It's got some fast moving winds on the south side, 115 to 130 knots. So this is really going to spin up here and drive the surface weather in the next several days. Low pressure is also making a move out of the Gulf and going to make room for the next one moving through the Bering. You can see it spun up here at 9,000 feet. Wind speeds 40 to 50 knots across the southern Bering and across the chain, 55 knots there, 60 knots around Dutch Harbor in Alaska tomorrow morning. Low pressure in the Gulf giving a steady southeast flow to southeast, and southerlies for most of the interior, still fairly light, 10 to 20 knots there. Not a huge change right now at 3,000 feet for tomorrow. Southerly winds 10 to 15. The big wind's going to start up across the Bering Strait, 60 knots there, 35 to 40 knots across the southern chain and the western chain, and 50 knots coming into the Pribilof. So turbulence ramping up, no severe just yet, but below 4,000 feet, considerable moderate the west and the Aleutians.
I can't really name anyone that has so much integrity as she does to the things that she's accomplishing. It's pretty amazing. Having Claire as a role model, just a strong woman in science and just so smart and so kind. It's just a huge confidence booster. Is that, hey, I could do that too, you know? That's possible, that's successful, that's what I want to do.
I would characterize her as a pioneer in the field.
The amount and quality of the work she's put out is second to none.
I know people who have a lot of tenacity. I know people that have integrity, but it's rare that people have both together in that, you know, that combination that Claire does.
Every morning, Dr. Claire Parkinson gets up before sunrise and runs 2 miles to work. She hasn't missed a day in nearly 40 years. To know the evolution of sea ice and how we observe it from space is to know Claire. This year, she's celebrating 40 years at NASA.
When I arrived at Goddard, which was in July of 1978, it was an incredibly exciting period here. Satellites were pretty new, but a lot of data had been collected.
NASA scientists were inundated with information, and Claire was in a cohort looking at sea ice, trying to make sense of a jumble of very raw, very new data. It was around that time that Claire and her team, at the time led by Dr. Jays Wally, created the principal sea ice record that we use today. How does something like that record help you do your job?
Oh, that record is fundamental to understanding sea ice. So without it, we wouldn't know how rapidly it's changing.
You may not realize it, but Claire's work studying the changing extent of the ice caps deeply affected our understanding of climate change, and relatedly, our understanding of how climate change affects life on Earth.
One of the clearest signals for climate change that resonates with people has been this shrinking of the polar ice cap in the summer that we're able to see because of Claire's work.
After we had a record that was about 15, 20 years long, we started noticing that the extent of the ice in the Arctic was getting smaller over time.
Sea ice is formed on the surface of the ocean and therefore is made from seawater. The biggest concentration is in the Arctic, and it's also where the biggest loss in sea ice is occurring. Every year, NASA reports on the sea ice minimum and maximum extents. As expected, the data is concerning.
By now, not only has this trend toward lesser ice continued, but it's even accelerated, so that now the decreases are greater than what they had been.
These trends are deeply troubling, but one thing's for sure. Our awareness of shrinking sea ice extent due to climate change was propelled faster and further after Claire Parkinson arrived at NASA.
I mean, she takes her job seriously, and the health and welfare of those instruments in space, yeah, she's on it. You know, it's one of the things you don't worry about because Claire's in the loop on these things. It's going to be fine.
In science, we stand on the shoulders of giants, on the shoulders of those who explored before us. But then, some among us are giants.
For a scientist, it's incredibly exciting to be studying these glaciers and ice sheets right now because they're doing something that hasn't happened in thousands of years. We're watching changes take place that haven't happened since the end of the last ice age. Tuesday was cold, I almost froze my toes. Oh, what's it gonna be next week? Who knows? That's climate. Oh, that's the climate you got. You take a bunch of weather and you average it together and you're doing the climate rock.
At a glacial pace, it means something's happening so slowly you can barely tell it's happening at all. That used to describe the very incremental movement glaciers and ice sheets experienced each year. But now that's changing. We're tagging along with 3 NASA scientists to understand the different lengths they go to not only investigate ice sheets and glaciers, but also communicate their often complicated science to the public. First, let's get oriented. Ice sheets, in pink, pretty much occur in only 2 places, Antarctica and Greenland. Glaciers, in yellow, play a key role draining melt off the ice sheet. Glaciers are also found in the high mountains, but we'll get to those in another episode.
So we know that something's happening in Greenland right now that's unprecedented in the last several thousand years.
That's Dr. Josh Willis, oceanographer at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. Josh and his team are tackling one of the major environmental challenges of the 21st century, trying to answer fundamental questions about how melting glaciers impact sea level rise.
With my mission, Oceans Melting Greenland, or OMG for short, we're trying to understand just how much of Greenland's melt is caused by the oceans.
Along with being one of NASA's top scientists working on the cryosphere, Josh is passionate about demystifying climate change in typically unconventional ways.
I think by reaching out to people with a little bit of humor, a little bit of fun, maybe a song, you really have the opportunity to help people understand and come to terms with what we're doing to our planet. Because it's definitely happening and it's definitely a big deal, and we need to start preparing for it.
Down at the opposite pole, Dr. Kelly Brunt is getting ready for a major expedition.
In December and January this coming year, I'll actually be in Antarctica down near the South Pole collecting ground-based GPS data.
This is actually Kelly's second expedition to the South Pole. The first occurred in December and January of last year. Both surveys are critical and will help validate data collected by NASA's airborne campaign, Operation Icebridge, and the recently launched satellite mission ISAT-2.
All three of these layers, that ground-based, that airborne, and the satellite, are all tied together. The ground-based helps validate both the satellite and the airborne helps give us more validation data for the satellites, but also a bigger story with respect to the depth of the ice sheet and what's going on underneath the surface.
While some scientists are taking measurements in the field, others are looking for answers in physics and lines of code.
For me, those projections that we are doing, they do have a very personal meaning.
Dr. Sophie Nowicki is an ice sheet modeler. That means she and her team have the important job of forecasting how ice will change in the future, which also predicts changes in sea level rise. It's a job she doesn't take lightly, especially since urban planning and infrastructure use her team's models to make decisions about the future and safety of their communities.
When we make those projections that are 100 years in the future, 100 years can seem so far away, like I don't have to worry about it, it's just too far. But actually they are not. It's really like the future that we are looking at that our children or grandchildren will see to experience.
Whether it's learning to communicate in new ways, traversing a swath of Antarctica in a massive piston bully, or taking responsibility for an impactful climate forecast, our NASA explorers are pushing the limits of discovery every day. But on a very human level, they're people with families and friends who have a stake in finding out why and how the planet is changing as rapidly as it is.
Every place, at least so far, that we have found life, we found water along with it. And so when we try to understand the thresholds for life, where life might exist elsewhere in our solar system and the universe, water is one of those things that we look for.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
And back with your marine weather update. Now we'll start with sea surface temperature, and the area to really focus on right now is around the Beaufort and the Chukchi Sea. We still have some warm water off the Chukchi coast. We have colder water around the Beaufort Sea coast, but not cold enough to freeze just yet. In fact, temperatures there are actually well above freezing in most cases. Now, as you look out of the Gulf of Alaska, you still see some very warm water. Temperatures here are running about 15, 16, maybe even 17 or 18 degrees C by this plot here. So very warm water, and same goes for areas along the southwest coast. Ice, well, it's still 350 to 400 nautical miles north of Utqiagvik and north of Kaktovik. You can see ice a little bit further south, but not much. It is not moving, and the marginal ice you see here across the eastern Beaufort Seacoast is just wrapping around in that Beaufort gyre. We expect no additional ice to form in the near future, so watch for further updates as we get into the season. In the meantime, southeast, you're looking at light winds for most of the inside passage, the exception being the Clarence Strait. Southeasterlies 20 knots and 4-foot seas there. An offshore wind tomorrow is going to strengthen in response to low pressure getting closer to home. 20 to 25 knots there with 6 to 9-foot seas on Wednesday. Thursday, winds coming up a little bit more from the south and east, 20 to, well, maybe 25 knots the further south you go. You're looking at about 8 to 9-foot seas offshore with 10 to 20 knots across the inside passage, 3-foot seas in the north, 5-foot seas in the south, and rain. Rain is on the way again. We'll have that map for you in just a minute. South Central Wednesday, we're looking northerlies inside of Prince William Sound. Light winds inside of Cook Inlet too, 2 to 3-foot seas there. Winds coming up as we get into the Barren Islands, 20 knots at times across the western Barrens, 4-foot seas with rain approaching. Looks like 10 to 15 knots on the northern parts of the Gulf with 4 to 5-foot seas there on Wednesday. And for Thursday, winds coming up even more. At least small craft advisories and probably some low-end gales for Thursday, 20 to 25 around Prince William Sound and just outside up to 8-foot seas, 12-foot seas outside of Resurrection Bay and Homer and Seward, I should say, 20 to 30 knots down Cook Inlet, and anywhere from 13 to 15-footers around the Barren Islands for your Thursday afternoon. Now here's where we really start to get into some of the winds and the waves. Around Shelikof Strait and Kodiak Island, 20 knots, expecting 3-foot seas in the Strait, 7-foot seas in the western Gulf around Kodiak Island, 7 to 12-foot seas down the Alaska Peninsula. Bristol Bay looking for 35 to 40 knots coming from the Bering Sea coast, 8 to 11-foot seas there on that south and southeasterly developing wind on Wednesday. And obviously you can look out west and see the seas are really building up as we get into Thursday. You can see that southwesterly flow takes over. 30 knots inside of Shelikof Strait with an 8-foot sea, 13-foot seas east of Kodiak Island. anywhere from 12 to 13 footers as you head down the Pacific coastline, 9 to 16 foot seas developing. And again, the brighter colors here as you get into the blues and the greens, that indicates higher seas there, and you can see how that's ramping up into the 20 to 25 knot or 25 foot range, I should say. The longer arrows indicate stronger winds, and you'll see those stronger winds south and west of the Pribilofs. Here's the Aleutian chain now. West and southwesterlies coming in on Wednesday. The higher winds and the higher seas north of the chain. You can see 13-foot seas there along the Bering Sea coast, 13 to 14-foot seas along the Pacific coast, all winds coming in from the south and west, and westerlies behind the front, which is approaching AKwx at this point Wednesday afternoon. 14 to 15-foot seas from Kiska to Shemya on that 35-knot wind. Here is Thursday, and you can see those stronger winds shifting to the north and west, the longer arrows telling us there's more wind there, and the green areas here indicating seas that are upwards of 20, 21, maybe 22 feet. This is all west of the Pribilofs right here. We'll have gales moving through the region, 35 to 40 knots, anywhere from 16 to 17-foot seas south of the chain, and 19 to 22-foot seas, especially from Atka out toward Unalaska, Dutch Harbor, and northward. And westerlies continue with 15-footers out across the west end of the chain, 30 to 35 knots on Thursday. Now for the west coast, you can see a strong southeasterly flow coming up, 40 to 45, 35 knots around St. Paul and St. George, 13 to 14-foot seas on Wednesday. And again, the highest seas, highest waves stay out to the west around St. Paul and St. George, 23-foot seas there, and easterlies coming off the Yukon Delta, 20 knots with an 8-foot sea, southeasterlies to 30 inside of Norton Sound. Look for light and variable winds generally around the eastern Beaufort Seacoast, but winds coming up around the Chukchi, 15 to 20. And as we get into Thursday, a broad easterly flow across the Beaufort, 15 to 20 with 3 to 4 foot seas, and a strong offshore flow, 25 to 30, coming off the Chukchi coast, 5 to 8 foot seas there. Recapping tonight's weather, strong storm in the western Bering, 970. That's approaching the western coast tonight. Low pressures moving into southeast with a broad area of persistent rain Wednesday night, Thursday into Friday for southeast, and periods of moderate to heavy rain and strong winds working into the west coast. High surf advisories for the south-facing coastlines of the Seward Peninsula, wind advisories in the Alaska Range.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.